Underlying more was a set of concepts and principles that we've developed and applied through the project. Some we've developed ourselves, some we've drawn on from previous EU projects. And I just want to briefly outline them. In fact, to save time, I'll just go through them one by one without introducing them there. The first is the distinction between roads and streets. In each of our 5 cities, we've taken what we call a feeder route coming in from the national 10T network into the centre of that city. And on the feeder route, as you come into the centre, you find 2 very different situations. And we've characterised those as roads and streets. So in the outer areas, effectively you have expressways where it's essentially for moving mechanised traffic. There are very few interchanges and there are no buildings directly on the streets. They're effectively urban motorways or semi-urban motorways, and they tend to have very high traffic flows, primarily cars. As you move towards the centre of these cities, then they morph into what we're calling streets, where you also have pedestrians and cyclists, you have buildings fronting the streets, you have loading, parking, buses dropping off people, pedal cycles and so on, people crossing the road. So they're much more intensive and interactive situations, and the volumes of traffic or movement tend to be less, and the dominance of car is also less as these other modes become more important. The second thing is picking up on a point that Paolo made earlier, that as we change up, we heard this morning in the presentation from Brussels, as policy priorities change, then the things you implement on the ground change as well. So without repeating fully what Paolo said, so historically, we heard in Brussels an example was developed to become a car city with lots of car parking and squares, wide movement corridors, etc., through to now where it's becoming a city of places, supported by sustainable transport, but with much more focus on placemaking, livability, and active traffic restraint. And this change in focus, as we saw in Brussels, and I'll give an example from London, makes a big difference on the ground. So this is just to the east of the financial city of London. In the 1950s, 60s, a big roundabout, we call it gyratory, was put in to try and maximise traffic capacity around the centre of London. You can see there's a church sort of rather abandoned in the middle there. And then 3 years ago, a big change in policy. The idea was to promote access by sustainable modes and to put a big focus on placemaking. So most of that carriageway space was taken out, and you can see there's a park there that's used by office workers and so on during the day, and by residents lunchtime in the evening and at weekends. So it makes a huge difference. And as part of that, we made a strong distinction or recognition that streets have multiple functions. Roads less so. Roads are primarily concerned with movement, not exclusively, but streets have multiple functions, and we put those under 2 different categories. One relating to movement by all modes of transport, and the other one relating to place. And place includes things that relate to the street as a destination, whether it's parking or loading, or people meeting friends there, or shopping, or whatever. And Transport for London, as part of a roads task force set up by the Mayor, who's now the Prime Minister, looked at the whole of London and used a 3-level classification of movement and place to classify each street in London, and that determines the priorities and the balance for investment. And here's an example of the feeder route from London that goes out on the left-hand side from the central area of London out to the M25 on the right-hand side there. And the different colouring scheme there is an illustration of the different levels of significance for movement and place as we move down the corridor. And in fact, towards the right-hand side there, you'll see a little dotted line, and that's the boundary between the part of the road that TfL is responsible road for and the part that Highways England was responsible for. And this was one of the issues we looked at, the tension between the policy and management priorities by city governments as opposed to national governments. And the thing that this brings in is the whole idea of street activities, that streets as destination are brought to life, as Paolo indicated, by their social, economic and environmental presence. And here's some photographs illustrating the way that communities use streets for different purposes. We then moved on, as Elaine mentioned in her presentation, to think about the street as a whole ecosystem, so that you have the carriageway, you have the movement and street activity, beneath that you have the utilities, and you have metro systems and so on. And then on either side they're fronted by buildings, and above we have airspace that is now important for Wi-Fi and for GPS, and in future potentially will become very important for drones. And the point is that all these things are interacting in various ways. Just to take a couple of examples, there's a strong interaction between the buildings and the demand for people coming to the street, so bus stops, parking, and so on, also for loading, servicing, and things like that. And similarly with utilities under the street, then sometimes they fail and there's disruption when the street has to be opened up in order to be able to repair the water pipeline or whatever. So lots of interactions, lots of flows, and the work that Ellen presented was essentially looking at, if you like, the carbon flows on the street. There are also financial flows, other things as well. When we get to looking at how we can actually tackle streets and improve streets, then really there are three broad levers that policymakers have. One is physical. We can actually determine the amount of space on the street that we allocate for different things like parking and so on. Also regulation, where we control which particular types of people can use the street or can park or stop at the side of the street. And there we really do those regulations based on three criteria. Some are based on the type of person, so a resident can use this parking space or use this street, or a disabled person. Others are based on the type of activity, so no access except for loading, for example. And the third is based on the type of vehicle, so buses only, cycles only. So we have quite a rich tapestry of regulations that can be very fine-tuned to the individual requirements of streets. And on top of that, we also use pricing quite often to regulate demand, congestion charging for traffic, or encouraging compliance with low emission, or also to look at, to control the demand for parking. And what we find actually is that these things are quite sophisticated, that when you look at a street, it's a combination of physical, regulatory and pricing measures that are used to achieve the objectives we're trying to meet. Moving on, street design zones and street design elements. Essentially, you have a building line on either side, you have a footway, you have a carriageway, but within that there are lots of sub-elements where you can allocate space to a range of different street users. And taking the idea of movement and place again, then generally speaking, most movement activities occur in the carriageway, most place activities occur on the footway, but that's not entirely true because parking and loading, which is a place-related activity, often happens on the carriageway. And equally, when we come to the footway, although it's mainly for pedestrians and street activities, most of the signing and traffic signals and things are all on the footway, although they're relating to movement. So there's a sort of complex set of interactions there. The other thing is the importance of recognizing context, that we shouldn't have a standard design everywhere clearly. It depends on context. And here's an example from a previous EU project called Artists, looking at a radial route into Freiburg, where in the outer areas, in the residential area, the street is quite wide, so there are separate lanes for trams, buses, cycles, some parking, pedestrian space. As you come towards the centre of Freiburg, the space becomes more restricted, but because place is becoming more important, it's a commercial retail centre, more of that space is now given to parking and loading, and more trees and so on. There was the case further out. But because there's less space, you have to squeeze, and the way they squeezed was to combine the same bit of carriageway for trams and for cars, but in a way that as the narrowest section is approached, there are traffic signals that give trams priority over the cars. Whereas historically, when you have a car-focused city, you would probably have got rid of the parking on either side or got rid of the cycle lanes or something like that. And finally, flexibility in space allocation. There are so many pressures and tensions on the road, but they do vary dramatically, the demands by time of day. Here's an example from one street near central London. The red shows the variation in parking activity along the curb by time of day. Loading is in blue, and drop-off is in grey. And you can see there are strong peaks and troughs. And so the point there really is, if we understand that demand varies by time of day, and also politically we may want to encourage things at some times and not others, we need to have methods of space allocation and regulation that are much more flexible and potentially dynamic. As we have more sensors, we can actually tell on a particular day what the demands are, and potentially we can therefore change the regulation and the way we use that space on an hour-by-hour basis. And we've been carrying out some trials using LED signs and road markings so that we could actually convey to motorists and other users how that space is adapting to the demands on that particular day. So that's a very quick run through some of the concepts and principles. You'll hear more later. Thank you very much.